I want to begin right now with our colloquium. I would like to begin with an announcement on an event that's occurring tomorrow, October 1st. The Center for Right-Wing Studies will host a talk entitled Hungary's Conservative Revolution, Sui Generis or a Future Pattern, which will be presented by Jason Wittenberg, who is Associate Professor of Political Science here at UCB. The event will take place in the Voldovsky Room of ISSI, and it will start at 4 and end at 5:30. Now I want to ask everybody, and I'll probably be deliberate in this, to turn off your phones. Turn off your phones, turn off your phones. It's embarrassing for when they ring, and it's disruptive also to the speaker. Thank you. Now, the format, as you all know, and I painfully go through this each and every time, is that our speaker will speak for about 45 minutes, whereupon we will then commence with a question and answer period for about 30 minutes. And I will introduce our speaker now, but then I'll come back on the stage, stand on the side of the stage. Please raise your hand, and I will jot down where you stand on the queue, and then I will exactly call on you, and she will proceed then to answer. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker for today. It's my pleasure to introduce Cristiana Giordano, who is Assistant Professor of Anthropology at the University of California at Davis, and is affiliated faculty member of our ISSI Berkeley Center for Social Medicine. Professor Giordano earned her PhD in anthropology here at Berkeley, and her scholarship focuses on foreign migration, mental health, and cultural translation in contemporary Italy. Her current research addresses the politics of migration in Europe through the lens of ethno-psychiatry and its radical critique of psychiatry, legal, and moral categories of inclusion and exclusion in the foreign others. She is the author of the recently published book, Migrants in Translation, Caring, and the Logics of Difference in Contemporary Italy, which is published by the University of California in 2014. The title of her talk today is Political Therapeutics in Italy. Please join me in welcoming Professor Giordano.
Thank you, and thank you, Martin, for creating this space for us to share our work. So as Martin briefly said, can you hear okay? My work in the last 15 years, has focused on politics of recognition in Italy, and I did fieldwork in Italy, which is also my home country, for 2 years between 2002 and 2004, and I was interested in looking at different institutional settings and the ways in which Italian institutions are approaching the question of migration and difference. And in particular, the questions that were at stake and that are at stake for me in this work are how are Western contemporary liberal democracies approaching the question of difference, whether it is in the context of migration or in other contexts. And I decided to focus my questions about the relationship between liberal democracies and difference in a clinical setting, an ethno-psychiatry, which is the setting that I will be focusing on today, because I saw it as a different response. I saw it as proposing and offering a different kind of response to the issue of difference and mental health. So today I think the core questions of my talk are, on the one hand, the question of recognition in any liberal democracy, so how any Western states approach this question. And on the other hand, what is at stake for me is also this big question in medicine today, which is the question of how to approach different populations and how to offer a culturally competent service. And the cultural competencies is only one way to talk about service targeted to different minorities or to different groups. Other terms have been used, like structural competency or cultural safety in Canada. And so I think the clinical case that I will present today speaks about the Italian context, and I want to go in depth in the Italian flavor of my ethnography and of this case. But it also speaks, I think, more largely, more broadly, about how to address the questions of difference in clinical contexts. So the way I've organized the talk is that I'm going to focus on the ethno-psychiatric clinic where I did fieldwork. It's called Frans Fanon Center, and it's located in Turin. And through a clinical case, I will also try to tell the story of the center, how it started and how it is embedded in the Italian history of psychiatric reforms. And then I will step back a little bit because I want to give you a larger sense of what the intellectual project is. And then I'll move back into the clinical case. And then I will end by talking a bit about Italian psychiatry at large and several reforms that characterized Italian psychiatry in the 70s. I met Mary on a late fall afternoon at the Fanon Center. She was in her early 30s when social services referred her to the ethno-psychiatric clinic in Turin. She had migrated from Nigeria approximately 3 years before we met, and she was still undocumented. Over this period of time, she had gone back to Nigeria once. When she returned to Italy, she was pregnant and had just lost her husband in a car accident in Nigeria. She went to the hospital for a prenatal visit where she was diagnosed as HIV positive. As a consequence, social services placed her in a locally funded program for pregnant HIV positive foreigners. She lived with her sister in what social workers described as very precarious economic conditions, in a small, dark apartment where a lot of people of all ages, mostly from Nigeria, cycled in and out. Her sister was probably involved in prostitution, but it was unclear whether Mary was as well. She gave birth to Luca, who was HIV positive, and then became negative after months of retroviral treatment. A year after giving birth, the social workers thought that she was depressed. She was crying a lot. She felt guilty about her health and her son's future. They referred her to the center where the doctors knew, as one social worker put it, how to deal with cultural difference. Patients often arrive at the Fanon Center after being diagnosed at the state hospital, and they're usually referred by other health services, by public and religious institutions. The referral usually takes place when institutions recognize that the person needs a different kind of treatment and their personnel is unable to offer it. It is more likely that at the center, patients can turn to cultural mediators or translators from the same linguistic group. In this context, mediators are asked to mediate between the cultural content of the patient's idioms and the explanatory models of the doctors. And they can also participate, and this was the very intriguing part for me, they can also participate in the process of formulating diagnosis and administering a cure. This allows for a different telling and a different listening. A short time after the initial referral, Mary became one of Dr. L's patients. I sat in on her therapy sessions for several months, often talked and conversed with practitioners in charge of her case. I spent time with her at the apartment that she shared with her sister. And 3 people participated to this session, Dr. L, a trainee, and myself. In this case, there was no Nigerian cultural mediator available to participate in the therapy sessions, but Mary spoke enough English, Mary spoke some Italian, and Dr. L spoke enough English so that they could understand each other. And also, Dr. L had conducted several years of ethnographic research in West Africa on healing techniques and and witchcraft. Like other practitioners at the center, she held degrees in both psychology and anthropology, and she was committed to bridging the practices of both in her clinical work. So this is a characteristic of the group of psychiatrists that I work with, both trained in psychiatry and in anthropology, and really committed to trying to bring these two disciplines and the debates around difference together in their clinical work. In the mid-90s, this group of politically engaged psychiatrists, psychologists, cultural mediators, and social workers that I work with opened the Fanon Center in Turin as an alternative clinic to public mental health services, which offers psychological support to documented and undocumented foreigners. Theirs was a response to the form of discrimination migrants experience in the Italian healthcare system, which, despite being universal, doesn't necessarily provide equal access and care to all. They also advise Italian social workers, state bureaucrats, and mental health practitioners who work with migrant populations, so they also worked outside of the clinical setting. In Italy, this kind of culturally competent service lacks any institutional or economic support. Therefore, at the time of my research, they were mostly funded by the municipality, the region, and occasionally by the EU, by the European Union. Italian ethno-psychiatry, originally associated with colonial psychiatry and the study of indigenous pathologies, is at the nexus of different legacies and discourses on mental health. On the one hand, it is inscribed within the revival of clinical ethno-psychiatry in other European countries. In particular, it draws from the experience of Toby Nathan in France, in Paris, and his technique of reorienting migrants within their traditional healing strategies as therapeutic. For those of us who are familiar with debates in medical anthropology, Didier Fassin wrote a famous article about the French experience of ethno-psychiatry, and he was extremely critical of this kind of psychological technique because he saw it as producing new forms of ghettos within the context of France. But on the other hand, I would like to provide actually a different reading of the Italian context because I think the Fanon Center in Italy is influenced by the Italian debates around the de-institutionalization of the mentally ill and the tradition of politically engaged psychiatry initiated by Franco Basaglia in the early 70s. Basaglia and his project of democratic psychiatry, of undoing psychiatry from within, culminated in the Basaglia Law in 1978 that ratified the closure of the asylum and the organization of community-based facilities as alternative therapeutic spaces. The ethno-psychiatrists at the Fanon Center are trained in this tradition. Basaglia, who was influenced by existentialism and phenomenology, and later in his work by Gramsci and Italian Marxism, understood madness as a complex nexus of contradictions, institutional, ideological, ethical, medical, political, that find their expressions in the bodies of patients and question the structure of medical knowledge, practices, and representations. This group of ethno-psychiatrists is also influenced, and you can guess it by the name, by Fanon's denunciation of colonial power relations and the violence embedded in all institutions. Through the work of Fanon, they acknowledge the political dimension of suffering and therefore try to avoid pathologizing culture and reducing symptoms to a strict medical account. Over the course of several consultations, Mary spoke of her difficulties in Italy. She did not have a residency permit. She was afraid of getting caught by the police and sent back to Nigeria. She feared for her life and her son's future, and she was terrified at the idea that other Nigerians in Italy might find out about her HIV status, which felt like a death sentence to her. She was haunted by dreams about her dead husband and could not talk about him without ending in a desperate cry. The threat of death was a refrain in her stories. Although Dr. L explained to her that her illness did not imply an imminent death and that retroviral treatments could make a great difference, her fears persisted. She once said, "If I take medicines here, I will heal, but if the police may send me back there, I will die. We spent a lot of time speaking about which social program could grant her a residency permit. At first, the story that emerged in our discussions were mostly about Mary's life in Italy and the pressing concern she had about her health and legal status. People's pre-migration stories are often impenetrable for various reasons. Many patients who are referred to the center have experienced different kinds of violence and abuse. Stories about home often resist narration because they recall a place that is impossible to re-inhabit, both physically and symbolically. At other times, home has been overshadowed by the urge to assimilate, integrate, and become others in ways that live up to the receiving country's standards of behaviors and desiring. Italian institutions that grant legal status to foreigners often require clear narrations of their migration trajectories and countries of origin. Such pressure often results in confused accounts that are symptomatic of an impossible encounter between bureaucratic languages and the complexities of people's histories. And here I want to give you like a broader sense of my larger work, not just within ethno-psychiatry, because you will understand where I'm coming from when I talk about ethno-psychiatry. My larger work revolves precisely around the mechanisms of translation that various institutions in contemporary Italy use to make the migrant's difference recognizable and includable. The larger context for this work is contemporary Europe, where cultural and political identities are being negotiated between a presumed cultural affinity between European countries and an increasingly multicultural and multiracial society forming within Europe itself. In this context, legal and illegal foreigners are often portrayed as a threat, as they usually are in several Western liberal democracies, a threat to national and supranational identities, security, and cultural and religious values. Contemporary Italy is struggling to conceive of a new European multicultural society on the one hand, and to deal with its own internal fragmented identities on the other. Italy only reached unification and a nation state in 1861, so it's a relatively young nation state, and is still to this day struggling for a sense of national identity. My ethnography is a reflection on the legal, therapeutic, and moral techniques of integration and cultural translation that have emerged in response to the increasing numbers of documented and undocumented others, among them refugees, victims of torture, of abuse, and trafficking. But in my research, I found that the Italian state reveals its legal and moral frameworks, particularly in the ways it approaches the issues of foreign prostitution and what the state defines as victims of human trafficking. Cultural difference often gets portrayed as and reduced to an issue of migration. Migrant exists because there are borders. In fact, we could claim that contemporary notions of migration only make sense within the context of the nation state. When I look at different projects of recognition that emerge in response to what the state portrays as the dangers of foreign migration, I also argue that the issue of difference exceeds the politics of migration. This excess is acknowledged in emerging therapeutic and political spaces that respond to foreigners' needs by including healing techniques from their home countries and by questioning the host society's techniques of inclusion. On the one hand, this ethnography unveils the mechanism of exclusion-inclusion embedded in the state's categories of recognition that, in the case of victims of human trafficking, only function through the binary structure of victim-agent. On the other hand, by focusing on ethno-psychiatry as a therapeutic response to the need for a culturally competent approach to foreign patients, I indicate how a new politics is possible beyond the binary opposition of the state and beyond psychiatric classifications of pathology and normality. In my larger work, I also document ethno-psychiatry's political impact on other Italian institutions, such as the church, the police, and social services involved in the rehabilitation program of what the state recognizes victims of human trafficking. At the time of my research, all these institutions were increasingly turning to ethno-psychiatrists for help in shaping culturally and psychologically appropriate interventions for migrants. Ethno-psychiatry became central as a practice that not only creates epistemological breaks in the discourse of psychiatry, as I will show through the case of Mary, but it also challenges the way the state recognized foreigners and how it defined which victims were worthy of receiving legal rights. The point that I made, this is the dense part, so stay with me and then I'll go back to a story that is easy, but these are important concepts to understand the point. So the point I make throughout my work is that all the agents involved in the integration of foreigners into Italian society, from state bureaucrats to cultural mediators, from Catholic nuns to ethno-psychiatrists, adopt a model of translation to be able to understand and relate to the other's difference. There is an unavoidable violence implicit in any cultural act of translation, we know that. It is the price one pays for any discourse of integration and inclusion in a multicultural society. The state enacts a violent translation. It does not see the migrant as an individual with rights and privileges, but rather as an autobiographical narrative that needs to fit the categories of recognition made available by the state. So the state makes certain categories, such as victims of human trafficking, asylum seekers, available, and those who are looking or want to be recognized or are in need of being recognized are forced in some ways to fit the categories that are available and that are made available by the state. This process involves an act of misrecognition, since personal stories are often irreducible to what the state expects to hear. The Catholic nuns I work with and state bureaucrats attempt to engage in alternative forms of translation to mitigate the violent effects of misrecognition. So they turn to ethno-psychiatrists for advice on how to be culturally sensitive in their effort to reintegrate victims. However, they often translate what they learn from ethno-psychiatry into yet other categories of recognition that reduce the other to a familiar presence. Ethno-psychiatry, on the contrary, uses other mechanisms of translation to make sure that the foreign migrant story and language is heard in its uniqueness. Ethno-psychiatry introduces an interruption in the discourses of the state and thus produces a new politics of difference that I understand as a kind of acknowledgement of difference rather than a recognition. And here I need to make a distinction between what I mean by recognition and acknowledgement. In liberal nation states, recognition is often described through the language of tolerance and inclusion. The term recognition seems to capture both the normative basis of political claims and the violence embedded in them. It comprises techniques that aim to make the social world intelligible to the state. There are very interesting debates in anthropology and in political philosophy. I'm thinking about the work of Povinelli and Charles Taylor about politics of recognition. My ethnography has led me to ask, what if the other cannot neither be known nor recognized? Would acknowledgement rather than recognition allow for a different politics of life beyond the logics of understanding and sovereignty? I understand acknowledgement as the political and ethical act of surrendering the desire to know through already established categories, and of accepting the challenges of difference and the possibilities of not knowing, not understanding, and thus embracing misunderstanding. I see acknowledgement as a space for what French philosopher Jacques Rancière calls politics, where the other's difference introduces change in established discourses and thus discard pre-existing identities. Rancière makes a distinction between policing and politics. For him, political action is about changing the social order, creating a form of disagreement that changes the meaning of political engagement and redefines what is sayable and visible within a given community. This is the political. Policing practices, on the other hand, are about the management of given social roles and places that are left unchanged, though rearranged. In light of this distinction, I make a parallel between policing and politics of recognition on the one hand, and politics and acknowledgement on the other hand. And this will become clear through the ethnographic story that I'm returning to now. But keep in mind policing and politics. By focusing on ethno-psychiatry, I want to show how this clinical practice can provide an instant or moments of politics, where the language of biomedicine is disagreed with and forms of acknowledgement are possible. During one consultation, Mary recounted a dream. Her husband had come to see her to tell her that he had died because his family had done voodoo on them, and that she and their son were in danger. She had to go back to their house in Benin City to find a wire and then come back to Italy. If she could not find it, something bad might happen to them. On this occasion, Dr. L told Mary not to fear her husband's visits at night. If he comes back in your dreams, talk to him. Try to find out why his family turned their back to you. Later, when we were alone, the therapist commented, in her context, dead people are not just memories or dreams, they're real. She further explained that dreams were an instrument of the present, an experience that provided memories from the past and reworked them in light of the present. This dream brought up other stories. Her husband's family was, in Mary's words, from a village where they did a lot of voodoo. His family was very envious of the couple because they did well financially and were able to buy a house in Nigeria and migrate to Europe. Moreover, they imagined she had made a fortune during her time in Italy, and now her son would inherit all of his father's money and the house. She was afraid of them and the harm they could do. She said they killed her husband and that they did not protect him enough, and that her HIV was the consequence of a spell. She also spoke about the bad worms inhabiting her body. They were red because they sucked her blood. She got them because, in her words, bad people had cast a spell on her when she was pregnant. She almost died, but then she saw a native doctor in Nigeria who helped her. Even so, the worms were still in her body. She also heard an ongoing echoing in her ears and head that caused her a lot of pain. She wanted some drugs because she had problems sleeping, which was why she had agreed to come to the center in the first place. Dr. L, however, did not prescribe any medicine. First, she listened to other symptoms that Mary presented. She had a strong pain in her ears, and the worms went from her head to her feet, through her shoulders and breast, and then all the way down her spine. Her knees were hurting too. Mary had seen her cousin, a healer, who poured a powder made of pepper and other things from Nigeria in her ear. Along with suggesting that she undergo further medical tests, Dr. L attempted to go beyond the initial diagnosis of depression. She asked Mary if she could speak to the spirits who were causing her pain. She also inquired if the presence of worms in Mary's body resulted from a failure to perform some rituals as part of her worship of gods and goddesses. In this way, the therapist was letting Mary know that she understood that rituals had powerful meanings and that spirits could speak and be spoken to, even in the clinical setting. Many explained that the pain had to do with something else. The doctor then asked about her family back in Nigeria. Do they know about your medical problems? What do they make of them? Her mother knew, and her father died after she told him about it. She felt tremendous guilt. Mary referred to her husband by his African name, Osagliato. Dr. L asked Mary what her other name was and what it meant. Osatuame, she replied. It means God has pity on me. Prompted by Dr. L's question, Mary said that her father had given her the name. When Mary's mother was pregnant with her, a woman from their village did voodoo, putting her at risk of losing the child. But Mary was nonetheless born healthy, and thus her father named her, God has pity on me. When Dr. L heard this story, she rephrased it by saying, "Your father was right because you're strong, otherwise you would not be born. You're still strong now." As she later explained to the trainee and myself, asking about the name in Edo, Mary's mother tongue, was a way to create a relationship of trust where Mary could feel comfortable evoking parts of her life in Nigeria and know that the therapist could attend to it. She specified that it was important to know when to ask this type of questions. The purpose is to let the patient express herself in her own terms and let her know that her references are not completely foreign to us. A couple of months into therapy, Dr. L asked whether Mary talked to her son about his dead father. "No," she responded, not without falling into despair. She also feared that her son might be doomed to a similar tragic destiny. While discussing the case with me, Dr. L had shared that it was difficult for her to deal with how the memory of Mary's dead husband played out in the therapy sessions. We knew Mary's sister had gotten rid of any object related to him in order to protect Mary from her sadness. But he appeared in her dreams and claimed that his family remembered and sometimes either helped or protected him. "Why don't you put a picture of him in a corner of the house and build an altar to him?" asked Dr. L. Mary started crying. She felt unable to do it. The therapy reassured her she did not need to rush it, but insisted that it would be beneficial to her and her son. Maybe she could also recite a prayer in Edo, she added, or go to the Pentecostal church. Mary cried hard, but said she would try to pray, but she feared going to the church because she didn't want other Nigerians to find out about her medical conditions. In the context of ethno-psychiatric clinical work, practitioners are engaged in what they call an intermediate space, a space of mediation, a space that they try to find between the therapist's theories and techniques and the patient's way of expressing suffering in an attempt to avoid reducing symptoms to biomedical diagnostic criteria. At the same time, they encourage patients to maintain relations with their respective backgrounds in forms that range from being in contact with family members, performing rituals, speaking their mother tongues, to attending groups or churches where they can meet their fellow nationals. Through Mary's case, I became interested in the question of when and how cultural material opens up or closes down the space of therapy. In many ways, I had to shift my focus to approach the issue of culture from a clinical therapeutic angle and to ask what work culture does in this context. The contours of what counts as the patient's cultural background are in flux. They take shape as a result of a set of relationships the clinical context enables. I, for example, was curious about the ways in which Dr. L evoked Mary's cultures in relationship to praying in Edo, or referring to her African name. What counts as her culture and in relationship to what? And how can this clinical approach be understood in political terms when it is also reminiscent of colonial approaches to indigenous pathologies? In clinical work, the anthropological and therapeutic takes on culture can be at odds. And yet, it is precisely this tension that produces encounters as spaces where categories are undone and a different listening can take place. This way of listening is a response to the new speech that emerges in the discourse of patients. As Dr. L suggested, the purpose of evoking cultural identification was not to identify the patient's cultural background, but to enable them to find a language and a memory that was lost in the process of crossing borders. I also began to understand the clinical use of cultural material as a way to reintroduce the political dimension of suffering, not just in the language of psychiatry, but also more broadly in the state's politics of recognition and integration of foreign others. In order to understand the nature of her symptoms and start a quest for a cure, Dr. L referred to the possibility that Mary was a devotee of Mami Wata, the goddess of the waters, dispenser of wealth and abundance, to whom many Nigerian women are tied by promises of loyalty and worship, and to whom they're offered as brides before migration. Failure to fulfill the duties of devotion may result in the goddess taking revenge and in the manifestation of bodily symptoms like strong headaches or the worms inhabiting Mary's body. In the cases I observed, acknowledging the existence of the goddess on the part of the therapist made women feel acknowledged or even validated to a certain extent in a sphere of their lives that other institutions such as the state, hospital, social workers, and the state classified as superstition. This acknowledgement was effective in reducing some of the symptoms they experienced. If we understand symptoms not just an index that signals the existence of an illness or disturbance, but rather as a sign or a symbol formed in the interface between the inner and the outer worlds, the unconscious and the conscious, and in which something of the illness is incarnated and manifested, for instance, the anger of the goddess or the sense of guilt of the devotee, then the therapeutic work revolves around interpretation, not decoding symptoms into diagnostic categories. This process of interpretation is a form of translation that I understand through Walter Benjamin's idea of translation as a way to abide and provisionally come to terms with the difference and multiplicity of languages. In other terms, I'm talking about translation not as a process aimed at finding equivalences between languages, but rather as a process of translating terms in between languages and accepting the possibility of not being able to translate, and the fact that any translation is a compromise, and it also produces new meanings and new languages. The symptom is in and on itself a translation of sorts. In the context of ethno-psychiatry, various forms of translation are at work. Patients and doctors translate between their different understandings of suffering and cure. Doctors translate between various medical languages and what may count as healing at different moments in the clinical work. I interpret the processes of translation at work within the ethno-psychiatric setting as forms of acknowledgement that have surrendered the certainty of diagnostic categories, or at least at moments they have surrendered this certainty. The certainty of a diagnosis as tools of recognition, and can pay attention to the interruptions and enigmas of the patient's speech. Translation here does not produce agreement, but rather disagreement. There's not the literal translation of symptoms into a diagnosis. For instance, practitioners at the center usually do not assign the diagnosis of schizophrenia or of depression unless they're dealing with patients who have previously received such diagnosis from clinicians at the public hospitals before being referred to them. In these cases, they may refer to psychiatric diagnoses to either question them or to continue the pharmaceutical treatments associated with them. Or they may use diagnosis instrumentally when they write psychological assessments for asylum seekers or victims of trafficking, knowing that some psychiatric categories can actually speed up the process of receiving documents. In trying to recuperate what psychiatry excluded from its field of understanding, ethno-psychiatry creates a space that aims to use difference, both cultural and experiential, as a fundamental variable in therapeutic work. In so doing, one of the ways in which ethno-psychiatrists work is by translating practices, experiences, ways of expressing suffering, rituals, symptoms, into the language of culture. Instead of a fixed notion, culture is a vehicle of translation, a concept that enables different types of interpretation in the clinical encounter. In this context, culture also takes on a political meaning because it introduces a difference that the state, in its various forms, can only recognize as belief and thus classify as unreal and untrue. Roberto Beneduce, founder of the Fanon Center, defined ethno-psychiatry as a clinic of ambivalence. I read this as referring to different layers of ambivalence. On the one hand, the patient's ambivalent positions in regard to their cultural identifications that shift in the course of life and migration. And on the other hand, the ambivalence of the ethno-psychiatric practice itself, which emerges at the juncture of different and often contradictory etiologies and ways of conceiving what counts as normal, pathological, and ultimately human. After this consultation, I asked Dr. L why she suggested that Mary pray in Edo or use her African name. What do you mean by culture when you evoke her mother tongue or suggest she attends the Pentecostal church? I asked. I was also curious about how she would go about assessing whether patients perceive this kind of references as either persecutory or therapeutic. Her response captured the complexity of her position. She said, sometimes in the clinical encounter, we present patients with pieces of their culture. At times, you have to reify culture to make things happen. By using a certain reified idea of culture, you can see how patients respond to it and how they themselves use it. In this way, we understand better what culture means to them. One strategy is to re-immerse patients in what is persecutory in order to become stronger. In the clinic, you use culture as if you were a tightrope walker. You reify it without mummifying it. It is a fine balance, and you create a dialectics among the participants. She continued, explaining that a complex process of reification, manipulation, and creation of what comes to be seen as culture takes place in the therapeutic space. In the treatment, there are moments when it is important to present patients with a possibly stereotyped idea of culture, followed by other moments in which that same idea is deconstructed and further manipulated. This is a complex process, something that can slip from your grasp, Dr. L added, if you do not know how to handle all the different phases of therapy and the various configurations that cultural references can take in the course of therapy. The idea here is not to reconnect patients to their cultural background, but rather to produce the conditions so that the subject can find ways to be in the world. The ethno-psychiatrist's strategy of relying on cultural material and on practices that they understand as familiar to the patient in order to provide care leaves room for a series of questions about the status of what is therapeutic. What happens if and when the tightrope walker falls from the rope and culture fails? I later asked myself. I was struck how well the image of the tightrope walker, which is very evocative and productive, captured the tensions the therapists see in their work. Is there a counterproductive potential to this approach that can influence therapy's outcome? Or, as Dr. L implied, can being re-immersed in what the patient perceives as threatening within this setting fulfill a therapeutic promise? How can this kind of work posit a new kind of politics for clinical work? Within this practice, acknowledging the legitimacy of cultural interpretations prevents the patient from getting caught in one hegemonic discourse of suffering and provides a different kind of listening on the part of the doctors. The cultural approach provides a space of critique of dominant techniques in clinical work and repoliticizes the issue of difference. For instance, I began to understand Dr. L's suggestions to pray in Edo and her listening to Mary's references to voodoo and native doctors not only as part of a therapeutic approach, but as a political gesture that creates dissonance with the apparatus of biomedicine and the state, which relegate cultural, historical, and economic difference outside of its purview. However, the benefits of demedicalizing suffering have their exceptions. In some cases, evoking cultural material within the therapeutic setting can provoke anxiety in the patient. In Mary's case, for instance, evoking the dead husband and his family's magic powers had a persecutory effect on Mary. I was caught in another set of questions regarding the failure of culture as a concept that could heal, or rather, I understood cultural interpretations as a vehicle of mediation that at times need to be suspended and bracketed, just like psychiatric diagnosis. In one of our conversations, another ethno-psychiatrist, Dr. A, told me of the case of Joy, a Nigerian woman who complained about hearing voices and feeling the presence of spirits inside her head. In particular, she had reported a dream where a spiritual husband, as she called her, sat on her head and ejaculated. Devotees of the possession cult of Mami Water, he explained, are married to a spiritual husband, another way to refer to Mami Water, but their devotion is often discontinued or tainted with ambivalence once they leave Nigeria. Nonetheless, women may experience that the ties with the divinity cannot be completely severed and thus feel haunted by her presence. During one consultation at the center, one of the practitioners made reference to the presence of the spiritual husbands in Joy's dream, to which she responded with a high level of anxiety. She stood up and started walking fast in circles while speaking to the spirits. At that point, Dr. A intervened because he realized that the spirits were threatening to Joy, and at that point of the treatment, the therapeutic team was not capable of handling such forces. He commented to me that if you invite spirits into the consultation, you must know both how to let them in and how to send them away. In that instance, he reassured Joy that the medication she was given at the public hospital would help her get rid of the voices and feel better. He therefore resorted to what he defined as an allopathic exorcist treatment, his words. Not because the presence of the spirits was something to deny, on the contrary, but because he believed that the patient was too vulnerable and the therapeutic team was ill-equipped to face the spirits. The patient's suspension between different etiologies can at times mean that patients may also benefit from naming their suffering with a psychiatric diagnosis, precisely the diagnostic domain contested and challenged by ethno-psychiatric practice. Moreover, medications can also figure as part of the treatment if they help the patient cope with unsettling presences and voices. This is what Dr. A described when he shared Joy's case and the difficulties that the therapeutic team encountered in dealing with the invisibles that the patient evoked. In this case, the doctor did not use the language of culture to communicate to the patient. In such moments, cultural interpretations appear to be threatening rather than healing. Here, I'm referring to the persecutory aspect of cultural references that could lead to a foreclosure of the cure and not, as Dr. L. earlier suggested, a necessarily step in the healing process. In this sense, both cultural and psychiatric diagnosis can turn out to be stigmatizing and paralyzing, closing down the possibility of exploring suffering and instead enabling it. Thus, when practitioners describe their practice as a critical ethno-psychiatry, as they do today, they refer to the importance of bracketing both cultural and psychiatric diagnosis and allowing interpretations to emerge in the space in between. This, for me, is precisely the space of the political in Rancière's terms, where already established discourses on health and experience are undone in order to create new languages, and where symptoms are not decoded into diagnosis, but they do the work of rearranging both the discourse of psychiatry and that of tradition. So I was particularly intrigued during my during the entire time I've been working on these issues, by the ways in which the political dimension of this ethno-psychiatric approach intersected with the Italian radical tradition of politically engaged mental health reform initiated by Franco Basaglia in the 1960s and 70s. Recognized as the leading figure of the democratic psychiatry movement in Europe, Basaglia became the director of the Trieste Asylum in northeast Italy in 1971, a border zone with Slovenia. There, together with a group of colleagues, nurses, and social workers, he started a systematic critique of mental health institutions and the violence embedded in them. According to him, the solution to the closed and violent structure of the mental hospital was not to be found in humanitarian gestures that increase the degree of dependency between reformers and patients within institutions, but rather in questioning the power relationship that characterized the practice of institutional psychiatry. This critique set the foundation for an anti-institutional movement engaged in dismantling the mental hospital and turning psychiatry inside out through a process of self-reflection on the part of mental health practitioners. This was not an anti-psychiatry movement, it was an anti-institutionalization movement. We can talk about it if you have questions about it. Basaglia interpreted mental illness as a socio-political problem and envisioned a public psychiatry able to comprehend suffering and social misery outside of the hospital walls. Influenced by existentialism and phenomenological approaches to mental illness, Basaglia focused his political and ethical efforts on a re-evaluation of the encounter between doctor and patient that the asylum denied and made impossible due to its hierarchical and closed structure. To enter the life world of the mentally ill, one had to break free from the situation of oppression instituted by the asylum and its apparatus of control. Understanding illness also meant suspending diagnosis and paying attention instead to the suffering hidden behind them. According to Basaglia, in order to have a relationship with an individual, it is necessary to establish it independently of the label by which the person has been defined. In my conversations with ethno-psychiatrists at the Fanon Center, Basaglia's legacy emerged as central to their clinical and political commitment to question the institutions in control of dispensing diagnoses and cures. Dr. L. once explained to me, "We provide a clinical space where we put diagnosis and psychodynamic interpretations aside in order to listen to what the other has to say about his/her malaise. Our methodology is meant to accompany the person in exploring all the etiologies that they have in mind. In this way, we are engaged in a political effort to see the other as a political subject that has something to say about his/her story and history." In the ethno-psychiatric setting, patients construct their own webs of signification, creating meaning out of present circumstances, perceived pasts, impossible futures. In line with Basaglia's teaching, diagnoses are seen as an expression of the hegemonic power of the institutions that inhibit a real therapeutic encounter. Also, diagnostic categories prevent the production of a narrative that, however tentatively, can link different ideology and healing practices. For Basaglia, the phenomenological approach allows psychiatrists to be exposed directly to the life worlds of the patients. Empathy allows for the creation of a terrain of encounter, he said. As Dr. L. explained to me, ethno-psychiatry positions the patient as a political subject, not because she's a victim of human trafficking or an asylum seeker, but because they tell us about their suffering in their own terms, by using their mother tongues and local etiologies. This means that in this setting, the patient can be in a position where power dynamics are for a moment suspended or inverted, because the most competent one is not the doctor, she's explained to me, but the patient herself. She further explained to me that we ethno-psychiatry use the mother tongue in therapy session not because we are anthropologically sensitive to the patient's cultural difference, but because the mother tongue is a political instrument that can be used to say certain things. Italian ethno-psychiatry and the debates that animate it come precisely from the political engagement initiated by Basaglia. The vigilant critique of state institutions, coupled with the commitment to rethink public services in the domain of public health, index a specific kinship between these two clinical practices. While this more politicized approach to illness and healing was at first oriented towards the economically and politically marginalized, since the early 80s, ethno-psychiatry has increasingly addressed marginalizations and dominations through a specific focus on foreign migrants. It argues that the healthcare of foreigners is a political issue rather than strictly a medical one, and thus echoes Basaglia's concern with the broad political dimensions of mental health and cure. Similar to the epistemological and methodological break that Basaglia created from within psychiatry, the ethno-psychiatrists bring into focus through their work the epistemological uncertainty that mainstream psychiatry is forced to confront in the treatment of foreigners. So just to conclude, I want to go back to the distinction between policing and politics that I draw from Rancière and weave it once more in this material. Both in Basaglia's work and in the work of ethnopsychiatry, I see the force of the political at work in the sense that their critique of psychiatry and of the diagnostic apparatus was able to undo the language of psychiatry and create new therapeutic spaces where a new language and set of practices were able to emerge and disagree with established discourses on difference. At times, the ethnopsychiatric approach alternates between diagnostic languages, psychiatry and culture, but what is striking for me is the acknowledgement of the untranslatability of suffering, which I argue is what makes or can make a clinical relation a political one.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I am compelled by your account of how you get patients outside of the sort of violence of the bureaucratic language and the clinical language and all of that. But I'm also troubled a little bit by something that I can see might happen in these encounters, where your practitioners understand this as a language of expressing pain, as a set of cultural materials, while the client themselves experiences their spirits or their deities as, factual, and not a method of communication, not a way of framing their experience or anything like that. So I'm just curious how, what your thoughts are on that.
I should, okay. So yes, that's a great question. I think I would like to go back to what the founder of this group, how he defined the clinical practice, which is a clinic of ambivalence. So I think your question actually speaks to the ambivalence of the practice. And in other conversations, the fact that they go in between, cultural identifications and sometimes, actually the interpretation that sometimes diagnostic criteria, psychiatric diagnostic criteria are actually useful is more my interpretation than what they would say, because they really prefer not to use them. But it's also true that when they talk about the spirits, like when the second case where the doctor said, we cannot handle this, we cannot, we should not be talking about spirits because as a therapeutic team, we are not equipped to deal with them. I think in that instance, he was actually taking it very seriously. It was not just a matter of cultural interpretation, but it was acknowledging that there was something about what the patient was evoking that really went beyond any possible representation of it. And so that there was something real about the voices. So I think there are moments where these are actually reality. Or when the first doctor refers to the dreams, where she said in her context, dreams are real. And we have to take them not just as the work of the unconscious, but as actual experiential moments of life, and not just life in dreams. Does it make sense?
These practitioners are doing something amazing, actually. And it was a beautiful analysis of how it is a political practice. So And I'm sure it's in the book, and I can't wait to look at the book. But I'm wondering about, the way this played out in the U.S. with Francis Liu and the wards that were designated specifically by race, to do psychiatric work. And it was. I mean, from everything that I've read about it, it was a big disaster because they didn't do this sort of thing. They didn't peel apart what was actually going on in these engagements and leaving a space for a kind of open creation of the therapeutic encounter, is what I hear you saying in some ways. But one of the things that's interesting about the U.S. version of this verse, and I'm curious about the comparison in Italy, is, that this seems very, I mean, it's psychoanalysis based. It's Frantz Fanon, and it's clearly working with a lot of those dynamics to the extent that I know psychoanalysis in the world of psychiatry. And that is in its own way fraught in a world of psychiatry that's, going away from psychoanalysis itself. So in some ways in the US, that got completely lost in the debate about how to deal with cultural difference and these wards. They're still trying to put this kind of Francis Liu's version of, cultural difference into the DSM-3, and it's like they haven't made any progress on it at all. And in part, I think I've always thought it's because that whole debate about how to engage psychoanalytically has been sort of lost. It's a battle that's lost.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you can talk about that issue in Italy around the psychoanalytic underpinnings of it and its role in the larger world of psychiatry.
Yeah. So, but maybe I will unpack for the audience one reference. So Vincent is referring to Francis Liu used to be the director of the, correct me if I'm wrong, the director of the San Francisco General ethnic specific wards, right? No, Seth can.
The Department of Psychiatry at San Francisco General, all the inpatient wards were focus units. Some of them were ethnic, some of them were LGBTQ or other. And he was the director, he kind of came up with that idea of the cultural competence of these psych units. So he wasn't just the director of those units were psychiatry at the General.
Yeah, exactly. And if I'm not wrong, also all psychiatric residents would spend 1 year of their residency working in the ethno-specific wards, correct? Right. So I actually interviewed him after I did research in Italy. First of all, Francis Liu is more, and the experience of the General Hospital is more inscribed within the tradition of transcultural psychiatry, which is which is much stronger in North America, and which I see as very different from ethno-psychiatry, because transcultural psychiatry, which is interested in the question of difference in assessing patients, it's still very tight to the DSM and to the diagnostic categories. So ethno-psychiatry is actually trying to move away from that. So there already we have a huge difference. But yes, you are right that's what I was trying to show, that the Basaglia legacy is a legacy that shows how from within psychiatry there was there was in the 60s and 70s the possibility of thinking about mental illness through a more psychoanalytic, phenomenological, existential lens. And later, through a Marxist lens, because Basaglia also recognized that it was not just about experiential difference, but that there was a structural difference also that needed to be addressed. So the question of poverty or class. And so in Italy, this led to the Basaglia law in 1978, which closed all the asylums. So in Italy, there are not psychiatric hospitals anymore. And there was, at that time, a proliferation of community-based facilities and a lot of opportunities of employment of patients in the communities. And we have Elena Portacolone here, who knows a lot about the experience of democratic psychiatry. As it is today, though, I must say, we have this idealized idea also of the... so at that time, there was this potential of really bringing together psychiatry and psychoanalysis within an institution, because Basaglia did not want to leave the institution. He wanted to undo it from within. So, for instance, he would often compare himself to Fanon, and he said, Fanon, in order to do the revolution and in order to dismantle the institution, he resigned as a psychiatrist, and he left the hospital and joined the revolution. But we, referring to his own revolution, we are not resigning from the institution. We want to undo it from within. We want to undo the language of the institution and introduce what is more psychoanalytic. Today, I mean, I'm a little cynical about what is going on with democratic psychiatry in Italy, because I think there are islands like this where the reform really worked. And in Trieste, for instance, you have hotels and restaurants that are run by patients. So it really works. Like, there is a community that has become a site of cure and caring. And so I can think about like 5 or 6 places in Italy where the reform really worked. But if you talk to many practitioners in state hospitals or in State Department of Mental Health, they would say that they are starting to feel colonized by the DSM model. So there is a friction there too, where this, rooted and beautiful tradition of thinking psychoanalytically about psychiatry is actually constantly threatened by other forces. Also because Basaglia often suspended pharmaceutical treatment, or the pharmaceutical treatment was not as, there was not much focus on it. So there are a lot of people that are not happy about that.
Thank you so much. Oh, okay, great. Thank you. Thank you so much for your talk. I had a question, and actually I was thinking, I think my question is very similar to the first question. And actually perhaps also I was thinking of how your talk is also in conversations, and very important conversations that are being had internationally, even here locally. Right? I'm thinking about this weekend here in the Bay Area, there was a soul. It's a somatics workshop for Bay Area community leaders and activists. And a lot of folks that participated were indigenous leaders. And so I think what I was thinking about was that I marveled at the ways, as much as I think they're doing wonderful work, I marveled at the way, though, that the dreams were also still seen as other, right? And then in my mind, I was thinking about the question that so many indigenous people, including a lot of us in our communities, right? Because these kinds of classifications have everything to do, in my community, with a lot of young men and women being put in a detention center, right? So I was thinking about recently as well, the big climate change march in New York City, right, where indigenous leaders were asked by very well-meaning people, well-meaning white activists. We definitely believe in climate change, but this is so important. How do we go back and talk to our communities, our white communities in America, that climate change is such a crucial issue? And the answers they were given is, you have a mother. Remind them of your mother. And so I was thinking about these classification of dreams still as other. I was thinking, when Malcolm X was asked by really well-intentional white people, what can we do? What can we do to help? And he said, go back to your communities. Right? And I bring that up only because my question is as a methodology, right? And I hear this from so many Tongan people and the therapists for their kids, right, and the kids being taken to child protective services because of the classifications. A big thing that we always ask is, how then do we make these connections, right, as indigenous people, as immigrants? Because all of these classifications mean life or death, right? That to believe, that to see that the patients, quote unquote, dreams are not just dreams, must then go back to what you said yourself, right? That the connection is the suffering. But that means then that the suffering is not just the patient's, right? As a methodology, if we were to use what Malcolm X said, it is then for all of us, our place of healing and to truly heal patients must mean then that all of us go back to that place of suffering within ourselves.
And to
You
the
know?
community that can heal. Is that what
Yes.
you're saying?
Yes,
Yeah,
and
so-
I think that that's just what I mean, bringing back Malcolm X, right? That it is not just the patients, quote unquote, that need this healing. That this healing is also, this is also between both the therapist and also the patient, right? And then knowing the patients and truly knowing those dreams, that those dreams are not just othered, is for the therapist himself or herself also to go back and know their own indigenous selves and their own dreams that they also share.
Yeah.
But these are no different.
Okay, let me rephrase it and see if I can tie it back to the context that I know best. I think in one sense you're saying, so in Italy, for instance, the work of Franco Basaglia was really focused on the community as a healing space, not because the community was going to receive and heal the patients, but because the community itself needed healing. And this is like the face of his work, where he was more concerned with class inequalities and poverty, and thinking about the fact that madness is also produced by structural difference. And so going back to the community also meant taking care of the community itself and bringing care to the community. So in a way, this echoes a little bit what you were saying, that the community is also, it's the collective that needs to heal in order for the individual to heal. But then there is another element, I think, to what both of you, the first question, which I think is actually extremely important, is so then what happens when ethno-psychiatrists, inspired by this community-based idea of healing, refer patients back to their cultural backgrounds? And I think that's when it becomes sometimes problematic. Because, first of all, and this maybe doesn't come through my presentation today, but it does in my thinking. I've been thinking a lot about these contradictions. What if, for instance, but back to the story. When the doctor suggests that Mary goes to see go to the Pentecostal church to reconnect with people from Nigeria. For instance, that kind of going back to a community, one has to think about what kind of community that is and who is framing it as a healing community, because Pentecostal churches are notoriously very ambivalent about the question of tradition and about the question of the body and of prostitution. And in Italy, for instance, many of the patients at the center who were readdressed to that kind of community did not want to go back, because they knew that these communities were extremely loaded by things that they didn't want to go back to, for instance. So I think it's important to understand what kind of community is evoked when we talk about going back to a community. Because it's not necessarily always a healing community.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Alessandro. I'm in geography here. I'm from Trieste, actually, and I work on Trieste right now on mental health centers and collective gardens. And I was actually struck by, I mean, you drew a parallel, it seemed to me, right?
Wait,
like,
I don't know.
I'm sorry. You drew a parallel between like nation states and asylums in the way I understood it, in terms of how borders work and borrowing and difference and dealing with difference. And I was thinking of how you talked about how the Basaglia reforms and they only really worked in a few cities in Italy, including Trieste, and only a few others. But I was like, I just wanted to ask you to go a bit further in like maybe sharing why you think that is in relationship precisely with difference and difference in relationship with immigrants. I wonder if these cities where the reforms were most successful actually have a different way of dealing with difference when it comes to immigration as well, or not, if there are parallels in that sense as well, or not.
Yeah.
Sure. So my question goes back to your distinction between the politics of recognition and acknowledgement. If recognition involves a sense of understanding through categorization and therefore defining and to some degree control of categories in that way, and acknowledgement is kind of standing in difference to that, what would that look like? What's at stake there, especially outside the clinic? What would a politics of acknowledgement look like?
Okay, so Alessandro, I don't know if I know how to answer your question because are you asking me whether the places where the Basaglia's reform worked better also had special programs for migrants? It's a borderland, although, yeah, I mean, when I talk to psychiatrists who work in Trieste and therefore are very committed to continuing this model, I receive very different responses. You know, some answer by saying, well, there's, you know, treating immigrant patients is not different from treating an Italian patient, because what we're really dealing with is another kind of difference. And, you know, Basaglia also talked about madness and the ability of the doctor to enter the life world of the patient as entering the difference, the experiential difference. And so some of the psychiatrists in Trieste, although in Trieste there are services for immigrants, but there is also an understanding of difference in a broader sense, which is actually very interesting, because one critique of ethno-psychiatry is why all this focus on cultural backgrounds and personal histories only when the patient is foreigner, you know. What about culture and Italian patients? So that's one of the limits, I think, of this approach, that it does not push it could explode the psychiatric categories even further by using this approach with foreigners and Italians alike. I actually think, I mean, my opinion, which is not very informed actually, because I don't know these cities well as I know Turin, is that these cities already had, you know, maybe for the political histories of their different administrations, they actually had a sense of community that was already very strong. And therefore, they were ready to receive this kind of approach. And so it was already, you know, in terms of social networks, they were able to sustain this kind of, but that would be a great project, like to actually go and see and make a comparison and see why it works here and it doesn't work over there. Huh? Great. Yeah, I want to know about it. I want to hear about it. Okay, Seth, your question. What would politics of acknowledgement look like outside of the therapeutic setting? So this is what I actually try to map in my book, because part of my work is also to see what happens when with this approach to difference and to healing exits the clinic and enters the immigration office, the police station, or shelters run by Catholic nuns, because the ethno-psychiatrists at the time of my research were consulting with all of these different institutions. They don't anymore. They've cut ties. This is another story. But at that time, they were very much in conversation. And so, for instance, I think, you know, in the case of the shelters for victims of human trafficking that are mostly run by Catholic nuns, I focused on those. There was an attempt on the part of the nuns to suspend some of the ways in which they would normally work to rehabilitate victims. And so, for instance, they are trying to suspend their desire to convert. So they, for instance, are not talking about converting souls. And they try to adopt a more therapeutic language. And so they talk about trauma. They talk about healing souls rather than converting souls to Catholicism. So there, what I see is not so much a politics of acknowledgement, but I see moments in which this approach that the ethno-psychiatrist brings in creates some bridges, some moments at least of suspension of what is the established way, for instance, of Catholic groups to intervene with marginalized. So I don't see it actually happening, but I see moments where there is a suspension, and therefore there is a possibility of thinking differently. Oftentimes what happens is that then other categories are produced, and so it often fails. I mean, I'm talking about a therapeutic practice that is very marginal, and that has interlocutors in different institutions, but also has a lot of enemies. And so they're not often heard. But there are instances where I think this kind of approach exits and makes a little opening that then closes down. And then there are other examples I could, well. Thank you.